it's the load-bearing Jenga brick in the tower, where if you try to take hell out of Christianity, it does feel like the whole thing collapses, because if there's no hell, why be a Christian instead of something else? And to me, I always just point that back at them and point out what a shallow spirituality that is. It's also about, growing in love and the fruits of spirits and all these other things. Well, it's like,
Right.
well, why isn't that enough?
Have you ever loved your faith community and also felt crushed by it? If you are holding reverence and resentment, certainty and doubt, this one is for you. Welcome to It's Both. I'm your host, Nikki P. And this channel is for people navigating those hard moments where you feel two things at once. Together, we hear stories from people feeling multiple things at once, and we talk about how you can do one kind next step and how you can find some personal growth even within the hardest moments. Today, we are talking about what you do with the wounds that religion leaves behind, because hurting people can hurt people, or they can become wounded healers. So in the next hour, you will get a grounded way to approach deconstruction without losing yourself, a healthier lens on hell, fear, and control, and why love stands up to all three. You'll also get a practical path to how you can still have a relationship with God while leaving behind all the harmful things that religion has taught us. So if you're in the messy middle, hit subscribe so you don't miss new episodes about emotional intelligence, navigating transitions, and real talk about holding multiple truths at once. And with that, let's jump in. Welcome, Brian. It's so good to have you here.
Good to be here, Nikki.
I'm excited to talk today because other than mental health and trauma, which is things that I love to talk about, I love talking about faith and kind of my grappling of faith and trying to find my way through what my new relationship is with faith. So I am just so excited to have you here and to be able to get into this conversation.
Yeah, I also love all those things.
It always is weird when I say I love talking about trauma. People are like, what? I'm like, I just do. I love understanding why we are the way we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what makes people interesting. It's also the parts of our story. The hardest parts of our story are also the most relatable parts of our story. I mean, everybody's wounded. We don't none of us get out of here unscathed, And it is, I mean, I think in some ways that's the core question of spirituality, the core question of, I think, living a human life is, what do we do with our wounds? What do we do with those things that hurt us? I mean, we've all heard that hurting people hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one way to go,
Yeah.
or figure out how to become a wounded healer. And I think that whenever you're talking to somebody and you get there to the hard parts, the traumatic parts, that's when you're really getting to know somebody. That's when you're getting past that surface level into vulnerability. And vulnerability is where we connect with people within our vulnerability, which is, in other words to say, within our pain.
Yes. Yes, you're so right. And I think of like post-traumatic growth, right? Like exactly what you said, what do you do post pain? What do you do with that, right? So I love it. I love talking about all those things. Well, before we jump in, I would love it if you could tell everybody a little bit about who you are, and not so much, like LinkedIn bio, but just like who are you? What are some bits about you that we might not know?
Well, I used to be an evangelical pastor. Most people possibly know that if they are tuned in at all to me. So that was about 5 years ago now that I put in my resignation and stepped away from the evangelical church. And so the last 5 years have been a real wrestling with what's next after that, and very much fighting for authenticity on the other side of deconstruction. And deconstruction is a journey. In some ways I'm still on it, and maybe will still be on it for the rest of my life. When you are in a system that demands certainty and then you begin to deconstruct certainty, I don't think you find necessarily new certainties as much as you become more comfortable with holding open questions and doubt. And so, I'm still on that journey, but that's kind of where I'm at right now. I publicly wrestle with these things. I could say I'm a public theologian. I just wrote my first book, which came out 2 months ago, about hell, where I explored many of my traumas and ways that I was shaped to think about God and myself and the world. That, I think many of them, while they were rooted in the Christian tradition, they actually brought me further away from God. And so part of that is what that book is about. But I don't know what else, we could start at the very beginning or where I'm at now. I've got 4 kids,
I think that's great. I want to do, I hate always saying both because I'm like, it's both, but I want to do a little bit of both, like who you are now and also your story of how did you get to this point, and where probably this point where most people know you now, right? And know what you're speaking about now on this probably larger stage than before. And so knowing what I know about you and like the journey that from my end that I've seen, which is, you grew up with a father who was a pastor in the Baptist church. So you grew up in that world. You were in the Marines, you were an evangelical pastor, and now you're here deconstructing your faith, finding a new way, and writing a book about hell. So I think generally, like, talk to us a bit about that journey. Talk about a little bit about your growing up in that world and how that journey has led you to where you are now.
Yeah, so my dad is an independent fundamental Baptist pastor. So not like Southern Baptist, which is
Good
more
distinction.
mainstream. Yeah,
Yeah.
Southern Baptist being, and there's different kind of Baptists. There's progressive Baptists even.
Mm-hmm.
Southern Baptist is the largest conservative denomination, maybe even the largest Protestant denomination, I think, in the country. But we were independent fundamental Baptists, which basically meant that we were very separatistic in our approach. Mainstream evangelicalism tends to be more culturally engaged, and so they'll have things like contemporary Christian music or, stage lighting, graphic design, pastors with cool sneakers. We didn't
It's
have
like
any
the
of
Hill
that.
song.
Right. We were very much like hymns only, no contemporary Christian music, no
Mm,
drums, no electric guitar, very rigid, King James only. Yeah, so very conservative upbringing. And I was really sheltered from not even just secular music, but like I said, even contemporary Christian music, I was sheltered
wow.
from. So pretty much all music. So a very sheltered upbringing that I didn't really question. And my parents are very loving people. They're kind people. I don't feel like I was well, I mean, I go back and forth. The spanking I do see as like an
Mm-hmm.
abusive practice. I
Sure.
believe that my parents, it was like the best version of a bad thing in some ways.
Yeah.
Without going into like incredible detail on the ways that I was disciplined as a
Yeah.
child, my parents are very kind, loving people, although I think they believe some harmful ideologies. But in my world, that was just the way things were.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was within this hierarchical sort of framework where you had God, who was this
Mm-hmm.
authoritarian at the top of it all, very demanding requirements for who was in, who was out, how to please God. God was holy. I was told from a very young age that I was a sinner and that one day I would stand before God and I was deserving of punishment, actually. And so this was kind of a whole world, a world of punishment and hierarchy and authority. And, my dad kind of below God as an authority figure to
Mm-hmm.
follow.
Mm-hmm.
And so quite rigid, but still quite loving household. I ultimately did follow in my parents' footsteps and go to Bob Jones University, which was a conservative fundamentalist university where I was kind of further indoctrinated, but also where I began to actually first confront some of those assumptions because the culture was so toxic. And even though it was still a bubble, Bob Jones
Mm-hmm.
was thought of as a bubble, I was at least out of my parents' household and meeting friends and peers who were wrestling with some of these things. And I found myself gravitating towards people who were kind of rebelling against that fundamentalist status quo. And so my first deconstruction actually was deconstructing fundamentalism and entering
Yeah.
a more mainstream evangelicalism. So a kind of
Mm.
Christianity where, you could have a rock band and wear more
Mm-hmm.
contemporary clothes and you could listen to most Christians don't refuse to listen to secular music. That was a big step for me in my college years.
And can I
Yeah.
ask a question?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
When you talk about your growing up period and such a specific Christian culture, did you at any point in your childhood, did you start to question or like feel in your gut like, I don't know if this is right? Or was there ever that tension internally without the language? Or were you fully in it?
So it's both. No, I'm just kidding. It isn't. It isn't. So I wasn't questioning it,
Mm,
but I don't know that I was fully in it. But I thought that my lack of being fully in it was more of a defect in me as much as a defect in the system. And so
yeah.
I really was like struggling with assurance of salvation. I didn't feel like I probably had the kind of relationship with God that I was supposed to have. And so I felt religious guilt and shame. And I don't think I was questioning the system though at any level. I was going along with it. And so things that felt off or wrong to me, I felt like those were probably deficiencies in myself as opposed
Mm,
to in the system. I will say I do have early memories of my older sister, who's a year and a half older than me, questioning some things. Like when my dad would preach about King David, my sister would always in the car after church, like go off about how she just didn't understand how this could be like a man after God's heart when he was so horrible to women and all this.
Yep.
As a kid, she saw that. Like, she
Mm.
wasn't exposed to any discourse around this.
Mhm.
That was literally just from the words being shared from the fundamentalist pulpit. She was like, this doesn't feel right in my spirit. And she was expressing some of those.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and I remember feeling like she was maybe even being disruptive or something. I wasn't
Mm.
expressing those same reservations in that way, but it was also built for me, you know, I was a white guy,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so maybe I wasn't as touched by, especially some of the anti-women things that she was maybe experiencing even as a child. Yeah, I began to maybe question a little bit more in college.
You go to college and you start seeing you're out of the bubble essentially, right? You're exposed to different people even though you're all kind of in the same Christian school. But talk to me about what that experience was like because then there is another level of exposure and like change and growth in that. So what started to happen during that college time?
So I joke and I sometimes say like it was easy to deconstruct fundamentalism with Bob Jones because just seeing them all there in one place was like very sobering. It was just just a bad vibe. Like
Yeah.
it wasn't a good thing that they were doing.
Mhm.
It was a
Mhm.
bad culture, a culture of it was very punitive, very authoritarian, very rules based, very legalistic. And it was a narc culture where you were like, the students would turn each other in for rule breaks. There were a lot of rules. And the way that you were often recognized as somebody who cared about the institution and were kind of a spiritual leader was that you could turn in
Turn.
other students. Yeah, totally.
I
And so
hate
you
it,
kind of,
but I also get it. I went to an Assemblies of God Christian university. Yeah, I went to an Assemblies of God Christian university, and it was very much, it wasn't quite that much on like you needed to narc on other people, but it was very much rules based. You had to sign like agreements that you weren't going to have sex. You couldn't be alone with the other sex. You had to scan in for chapel. Like you had to scan in to prove that you were going to chapel. You weren't allowed to watch rated R movies. You weren't allowed to dance because dancing led to sex. So I mean a lot of that like I understand in the sense that you're going to this place, this Christian university, which you would think would like solidify your beliefs. But for me, that was the same exact point when I started to go, shit, what? Like what is happening? Like seeing it all together in one space. I
it
definitely
wasn't
understand that.
attractive. It wasn't a compelling worldview. So yeah, what you just described sounds so much like Bob Jones, actually. Really, really similar. Chapel was required. No touching the opposite sex. You couldn't even hold
Mm-hmm.
hands, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that for sure. And I fell into a group where, I mean, I was more attracted to like the quote unquote rebellious kids, the ones
Mm-hmm.
who didn't drink the Kool-Aid. They were just more relatable. They were more safe. They weren't going to turn me in for stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I was also exposed at that time to voices outside of fundamentalism that were more mainstream evangelical voices, which was really compelling to me because even though fundamentalism and evangelicalism share a lot of similar theology, they both believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, the exclusivity of Jesus, literal, everything is literal about the from the miracles to the, sort of a woodenly literal interpretation of like a sacrificial cross that like appeases God's wrath in this sort of transactional way. All of that is shared between fundamentalism and
Mm-hmm.
evangelicalism, but
Mm-hmm.
the posture with which they hold those beliefs is really different. And I was exposed to voices like Tim Keller, John Piper, honestly, in the early
Mm.
2000s, even Mark Driscoll, I'm sad to say, was somebody that I was attracted to because he was. Again, I was at Bob Jones, right? So picture at Bob Jones, everybody's in a suit and tie, required chapel, no
Mm-hmm.
drinking, no beer,
Mm.
no rated R movies, no dancing. And here's Mark Driscoll, who's like, yeah, hell yeah, I'll have a beer and I'll worship Jesus and then I'll
Mm-hmm.
smoke a cigar afterwards with the boys. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I could be like a normal guy and still hold on to all this theology. That was very attractive to me, even
Yeah.
though there was a lot of toxic masculinity associated with him. To me, I didn't even notice that at the time because the world
Mm-hmm.
I was in was so patriarchal and hierarchical that it wouldn't have even struck me as odd that, he had that brand of toxic masculinity. It was only years later that I saw that for what it was. But yeah, a lot of those voices were attractive to me because it was like, oh, I could still hold on to this theology without being a heretic, but I could be
Yeah.
more normal. And so coming out of college, I transitioned into evangelicalism and I got more excited about my faith than ever. I mean, part of it was in fundamentalism, even though they believe in Jesus, they don't actually talk about Jesus that much.
Mm.
Really is about like all the stuff that you're supposed to stay away from. That's really what
Mm-hmm.
spirituality is about. It is just about not being worldly. Everything is about being polluted by the world, being polluted by sin. And it was
Hmm.
less about a loving relationship with Jesus, imitating Jesus, following Jesus, being moved by the sacrifice and love of Jesus. And so, again, while evangelicalism had similar theology, they emphasized grace, love, mercy,
Hmm.
and the person and work of Jesus Christ in a way that wasn't being emphasized in fundamentalism. And I found
Yeah.
myself very drawn to Jesus again for the first time in some ways. Even though I grew up in this Christian fundamentalist home, I was almost like I didn't really feel like I knew Jesus or who he was
Yeah.
until I was in evangelicalism. And so I dove in. I was eating it up. I read like every John Piper book and every Tim Keller book and started listening to Matt Chandler sermons, and I was like all in. And I joined the Marine Corps out of college, but started going to an evangelical church where I got very involved, became a community group leader, and to the point where when I got out of the Marine Corps, they invited me to come onto the pastoral team and help launch a new multi-site location of that evangelical church.
Okay, I have two questions. How'd you get to the Marines from where you were? Is there a connection, or was it just kind of
Yeah,
like, I need something, I'm gonna
right.
do this?
There's a few things. So I graduated in 2008 and there was a financial crisis happening. And my friends who had graduated right before me were really struggling to find jobs. And I was
Mm,
hearing that the economy wasn't great. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had changed my major like 4 times and ended
gotcha.
up with a marketing degree. And by the time I was graduating with that marketing degree, I knew that I was not really that interested in marketing.
Yeah.
And I was starting to become more interested in ministry because, growing up as a pastor's kid, I was always asked, "You gonna be a pastor like your father?" And my answer was always no, because I actually
Mhm.
couldn't see myself in that fundamentalist world. But by my senior year in college, when I was beginning to be exposed to evangelicalism and beginning to kind of get a vision for Jesus and ministry that I could get excited about, I started to feel like, hey, maybe I do want to be a pastor. But I think I had the wisdom to know that I wasn't ready yet, that I had been very sheltered. I grew up in the
Yeah.
bubble. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know how to be a human being in a world of people that were different from me. And I think I had the wisdom to know that what the world did not need was like another pastor straight out of college, straight
Mhm.
out of this homeschooled bubble.
Yeah.
And so for whatever reason, yeah, I think I had met like an officer selection officer on campus that kind of gave me the pitch, and it resonated with me both on that economic level, on that level of getting some life experience. And then I think there was also a deep level that I've only become more recently aware of, that I never really felt like I fit in with the norms of masculinity in the
Mm.
Christian world I grew up in.
Yeah.
And I knew that I think I wanted to prove something to myself and to the people around me. Everyone was shocked. Nobody saw it coming. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, you see how
Mhm.
I am. You see how I am now. You see who I
Mhm.
am. Most people, when they find out that I used to be a Marine, they're like, huh,
That's right, yeah. I was like, "Wait, how did
interesting.
that come in?"
That's
Okay.
how everybody felt when I joined too.
Yeah.
Everybody was like, "What? Brian joined the Marine Corps?" Like nobody saw it coming. And I think
Mhm.
I knew that I wasn't the kind of guy that would do it. And again, I thought that was a problem with me. Rather than being like, "Oh, that's not who I am and I should embrace myself," I actually felt like I needed to do something to become more of the kind of guy that I was supposed to be. And I'll tell you what, my dad had never been prouder of me than when I joined the Marine Corps. He was obsessed.
Yeah.
Like he loved it. And I think it did help me get over some of that stuff, because what I actually found out is these guys ain't shit. Like I think
Mhm.
I think it's not that I realized like, oh, I have successfully conformed to this. I think it helped me get over that need to conform and be like,
Mm.
oh, I actually don't fit in that world because it's actually not really for me. I didn't,
Mhm.
I mean, I have a lot of good memories from that experience. I met a lot of wonderful people. Overall, I did not find that culture to be helpful to me. Some people, like, their whole personality is defined by the fact that they like used to be in the Marines. People are still surprised when they find out, and I'm proud of that. Like, I don't wanna
Yeah.
be the kind of person that seems like he used to be in the Marines, to be honest. No shade to my, deeply militant, brothers, but, that's just not the kind of masculinity that I was embodying, but I think there was, like, a sense of wanting to prove myself according to the norms of the patriarchy as well.
Mm. Yeah. Now that you explain it, makes so much sense. And the other thing I was thinking as you were talking earlier is I'm so curious to hear what your perspective is around what is the what is the pull of the evangelical world? Because I had been raised in a lot of different denominations, and when I was in I would say middle school or high school, I got really involved. We moved to Mississippi, and I got really involved in a very evangelical Assemblies of God church. And there was something about that. I mean, talk about the bothness. A lot of why I started this, that it was the most healing and wonderful community and one of the most destructive at the same time. Like I went head first. I was like, absolutely, I have a community, I have people. There was obviously so much there that was so detrimental to who I am, while at the same time, pieces of it going, it also kind of helped save me, and not in the salvation sense, but like it was a very lonely, isolating time. And so when I hear people who've been in evangelical world, I hear a lot of that. Like there is this like intense pull that the evangelical world has that I don't know that I see in other places. I'm
Yeah.
just curious in your journey, like why do
Yeah.
you think that is?
Well, I think many of us feel this when we deconstruct. That loss of belonging is quite
Mhm.
profound, and it can be really tough to find that outside of the church. For all of its problems, the church does do community better than most places. And you can point to a lot of issues with the way the church does community. It provides belonging and inclusion with an asterisk, like there's all these
Mhm.
conditions to be met, and you can easily lose that belonging. But I mean, it's not that easy to find outside the church, especially as you get older, in your 30s. When you're deconstructing in your 30s, like, good luck making new friends in your mid-30s. It can be really challenging, but the church does provide some built-in friendship. It's constantly encouraging you to be together, to be embodied with each other. And then I do think that there is a posture of vulnerability that comes when we are seeking spiritual connection. I think a lot about some of the profound moments of worship that I've experienced in evangelicalism, whether singing with my hands raised or whether in prayer circles where other men are laying hands on me and praying for my family. Like
Mhm.
when we think about like a male loneliness epidemic, men really have a hard time being vulnerable with one another, talking about the deeper things, carrying each other's woundedness, and in the church they do that. They enter into that posture very frequently. You have spiritual
Mm.
fathers who are like
Yeah.
battling for your marriage, praying for your
Mhm.
family when your kids are sick, praying for you, lifting you up in that way. Like that is a really powerful thing, especially I think to receive that from men, which I don't see the world doing that very well outside of the church.
No.
And I will also say that it can be quite artificial when it's in the church as well. I'm not saying that the church
Sure.
has incredibly healthy masculinity all the time, but I did have those experiences, and I think you know what I'm talking about. That
Mhm.
where you
Mhm.
have these sort of quote unquote spiritual fathers. Now, there's a lot of abuse that can also be associated with that. This expectation of obedience or of pleasing them at the cost of abandoning yourself, right?
Mhm.
So, like
Mhm.
those are all the flip sides of that. But I don't think we can negate some of the power that is, and I don't think the evangelical church has the monopoly on seeking an experience of communion with the divine together. But I think when you're with a group of people and you're seeking to experience connection, there is something powerful and human that happens. And you can call it spiritual, you can call it divine, you can call it human. I think connection like that is human. And that does happen in the church. Like, I mean, a lot of men just struggle to show emotion at any level, and they very
Mhm.
rarely enter a space of just abandon and emotion. But I saw grown men in my evangelical church, hands raised, eyes
Mhm.
closed, just wanting to touch God. And like
Mhm.
you can laugh at that and call it corny, but for some of those guys, that's the only time that they're letting themselves go like that into that space of
So true.
vulnerability.
Yeah.
So there is something very healing about the vulnerability that comes from that. And I think those are things that we lose when we deconstruct without any meaningful sort of spiritual reclamation on the other side of that.
Yes, 100%. And that brings me to kind of what I wanted to hear next, which was, so was that some of what the pull was for you? So you're getting out of the Marine Corps, you're going in to be a pastor in this evangelical church. Like talk to me about what that experience was and then how that led to your next kind of phase of deconstruction, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so I didn't love my time in the Marine Corps. While I was there, it kind of solidified for me that I wanted to pursue ministry when I got out. So I was already
Mhm.
dreaming of using my GI Bill when I got out to go to seminary and then pursue
Mhm.
ministry. But I didn't have a clear idea of what it was going to look like. So it delighted me when the church that I was already a part of approached me during, when I had about a year left in the Marines. They came to me and were like, hey, when you get out, we really see a lot of potential here for a plant within
Mhm.
our church ecosystem. We want to start a new
Yeah.
site. We think you'd be great at it. And so I began kind of praying about that. And it seemed like just a slam dunk. I didn't have to go anywhere. I loved the town where I lived. It was this very cute seaside town that I launched a church in Beaufort in 2012, in this little town by the sea in eastern North Carolina. And so it was honestly just a very rosy experience. I'm also like, I loved pastoring, but And the idea of church planting was exciting, but I'm actually not very entrepreneurial. I'm a creator. Like, I'm good at writing a sermon, writing a essay, writing a meditation, creating content creatively is my gift, not necessarily like being a CEO. um, or like launching a new organization. That just has not really been as much my gift. So it was great being a part of this multi-site church where there was a lot of help and assistance, so I could do the things that I was good at, and I had people around me for some of the other things, which was great. So it was a really good fit on a lot of levels, and for a few years it was like my dream job.
Did something happen? And
Yeah.
then, or was it the slow burn? I guess that's
No,
my
no.
question.
There was definitely, I mean, both, yes, but I think that Trump was the kind of initial
Mm.
shattering. So I started the church in 2012, and for like 3 years, I just had rose-colored glasses on all of evangelicalism. I was vibing. We were having a good time. 2015, when Donald Trump became the front runner for the Republican nomination, was really the first moment that my rose-colored glasses towards evangelicalism began to shatter. I was surprised that he was so popular. I didn't see it coming. When he first announced, I thought it was funny. I thought that he would be easily dismissed. And so lo and behold, when a bunch of people in my church are like purchasing Trump flags, and my parents are defending the Access Hollywood tapes and comments saying it's just locker room talk, and people that I respected within evangelicalism were basically backing him, saying that, he's the lesser of two evils and this is the best thing. I was horrified. I was like, this is not who we are. That's what I thought. And so I don't believe that anymore, by the way. That's part of the journey of deconstruction, from when I first had this shattering to when I actually left the movement, was really the journey of going from this is not who we are to ultimately in 2020 when I quit, I was at the place where it was like, this is exactly who we are and who we've always been, and I finally have eyes to see it. And it took me some time to get there. But that was the moment that I first began to feel some cognitive dissonance between where I was at and where the movement of evangelicalism was at. I took that on as marching orders to like, okay, I'm a part of this. I love it. These are my people, and I'm going to fight for them. And so I began to do what I could to push back against the worst impulses in evangelicalism, talking about loving your neighbor. If they're going to listen to Fox News most nights of a week, and this, little 45-minute segment on Sunday morning, I get to challenge them with a different perspective. And during that time, I also began to, I think, finally give myself permission to think my own thoughts, because I don't think I could have articulated this at the time that this was happening, but in retrospect, I realized that seeing evangelicalism line up behind Donald Trump made me realize that I had been just swallowing what they were feeding me and just assuming that these guys knew better. After all, I was this fundamentalist who I was like still like soaking up the freedom and because fundamentalism was a real cul-de-sac. Like, there was such a small group of people that you were allowed to listen to. Even even people like, I was saying, like John Piper or Tim Keller, who are, by all accounts, still essentially fundamentalists. They are still conservative Christians, but even they were too far left. So my vision of who was acceptable as a fundamentalist was so small. And so there were a few years where I was opening up and just soaking things in, and I just assumed that these people knew better than me. But when those people started to fail me, and when those leaders were obviously kind of, because I didn't know everything, but like when I saw Donald Trump, I was like, okay, maybe I'm not the smartest guy. Maybe I haven't done all the work about like a political philosophy, but I know a bad dude when I see one. And I don't actually. And so if your moral discernment doesn't enable you to see that as a bad actor, as a grifter, as a downright evil man, then I all of a sudden was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't listen to everything you're telling me. Maybe I actually need to trust myself a little bit. And I don't know that was not a light switch moment, but I think that was the process of those few years once 2015 came. And so that was all kinds of things. It was like, well, if they were wrong about him, what else are they wrong about? What else aren't they telling me? What else do I need to do work on for myself? And one of those issues was hell. Other issues like women in ministry. I was a part of a complementarian church, so I had always just accepted as reality that only men should be pastors. Men and women have different roles, et cetera, et cetera. Queer people
So
are.
even at your evangelical church, this was their belief as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
complementarian. Yep. male. Now we were a little bit more flexible than some complementarian churches in that we had like female deacons and female worship leaders. And I always made it a practice to make sure that we gave women stage time. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
that was like, it's like throwing them a bone basically.
Yeah.
What they didn't have was a seat at the table. What they didn't have was decision-making power within an organization. That was a boys' club. And that was all I knew. It never even struck me that was weird. Like right now, it gives me the heebie-jeebies thinking about just like 6 white guys in a room making all the decisions for everyone.
Yeah.
Like that's so like insane. Like how were we okay with that? But at the time, of course, that's who made the decisions. That's who's always made the decisions. And it didn't even, I mean, that's basically even my view of God was very hypermasculine probably. And I wasn't even necessarily aware of that. But of course, men would represent God when God himself is basically a him, right? So all that stuff, I began to be exposed to more voices because, well, the thing is, I knew I wasn't a Trumper. Then all of a sudden, I mean, within evangelicalism, I mean, 87% went for Trump. So there are evangelicals that are against Trump, but more and more, if you're going to be associated with those people, you're going to be on the progressive side of evangelicalism and you're going to be exposed to other positions. You're going to be exposed over that time. As I was doing more reading, I was exposed to more egalitarian thinking, affirming theology, more or leftist social policy and things like that, which made way more sense to me. Like I had always just been an unthinking conservative in the sense that like, of course you're a conservative. I was raised being told the Democrats were demonic, right? Like there was no option. I didn't ever even consider that you could be anything other than conservative. But now I saw where it led. And so I began to allow myself to go outside those lines because I couldn't be. Yeah, Trump made it easy. In many ways, it was a gift to me because it was, I could have just kept coasting in that world, but Trump made it unignorable where I was like, this is not who I am. And so it did take me some time. And so 2020 was when it kind of came to a head where I, at that point, had been reading and been in, I've been exposed now to a lot of different viewpoints. And at that point, I was probably censoring myself in various ways where I had grown and evolved in ways that I wasn't ready to even say publicly because I was trying to exist within that system. And so I was having to silence certain parts of myself, which was becoming increasingly difficult and uncomfortable. And I think I was also aware that there were other parts of me that I wasn't even ready to acknowledge yet, that because it would mean, to be really honest about that, would mean losing my job, losing my community, and getting the hell out of it completely, which was a scary thing to think about. But 2020, that pause, we often need a liminal space to transform. When things are working, when things are coasting by, it's very hard to change because it's costly to change. But when things stop working and, the brakes are slammed on your life, that is often the space where we can conceptualize actually transforming. And so I think that, a lot of people made that move in 2020. It was like the Great Resignation, they call it.
Yeah.
And so I was a part of that.
Okay, quick pause here because I want to share something that I've been working on. Alongside of this show, I'm launching a companion podcast called It's Both, Guided Meditations for Anxiety, Emotional Regulation, and Real Life Transitions. It's a place for when you don't want more advice or analysis, just a guided way to slow down, notice what you're feeling, and come back into your body. These meditations are grounded and for real life, some shorter, some longer, and they're not about emptying your mind or fixing yourself. So if that sounds helpful, you can search It's Both Guided Meditations wherever you listen. The links are below in the show notes as well. Okay, now let's get back to the episode. Oh my gosh. So much here I feel like I could ask you about, but it makes so much sense. And I'm imagining when you talk about your deconstruction and your journey and, sounds like you're still on that, right? You're still on that journey. There's all these pieces you're still, I would imagine, working through.
I mean, yeah, I think my worldview feels more coherent now than it did a few years ago. But I think for me, I don't ever want to have the same closure that I had. I think I had a level of certainty that was not real or desirable. It was necessary for the system that I was in. I talk about this a little bit in my book, that when hell is a part of your mental model for the universe, if you believe that, in other words, if you're wrong about religious questions, that you could be punished in the afterlife, then the stakes are really high to be right. And so you end up manufacturing a sense of certainty that's not even real or necessary. And so I will never, it's not like I had these beliefs, I deconstructed, and now I've got these new beliefs. I don't see it that way at all. I don't feel like I've planted the flag in what I believe now in the same way because I don't need to. And I think that I feel like my spirituality at this point, evolution and growth is a part of it. And I expect that I'll continue to change my mind, that I'll continue to change the way that I view things and talk about
Mm-hmm.
things, and that is not, that doesn't have to be scary anymore. And so I'm only still deconstructing in the sense that I'm gonna always be, I
Right.
think, reckoning with,
Yeah.
because that's just life.
Yeah. Well, I think that's such a beautiful and healthy, and for a lot of people, completely new way to view this, because most of the time when I have interacted with people that have, quote, deconstructed, it often has meant historically they've left the church, they've left this belief in a higher power, in a God. And I've also heard people that have said, I've deconstructed and like I did it and then I reconstructed and like, here's my new
Right.
belief system. But I think to your point, that's not reality. That's not life. Life is always evolving, it's always changing. And I think, one thing that God has tried to teach us, in my belief at least, is that we have to be open to that. We have to be like constantly adjusting to that. I mean, that's what to me empathy and compassion is, right? And so I just think it's a really beautiful way to view your faith and your journey moving forward because it's very human. And it also, I think, takes a lot of the pressure and the guilt and the expectation of what it should be, which I think is where many of us get stuck. It's like the expectation or the guilt or the pressure then makes us feel like we have to show up or act or be in a certain way rather than being curious.
Yeah, and I think that's really hard for pastors, especially. When I was a pastor, I felt like I was supposed to know everything. I was supposed to have all the answers. And, I'm not a pastor now. Some people say, oh, you're still like a pastor. I mean, that's fine. And maybe I'll be a pastor again someday. That's not really the point. I think, regardless of how I label myself or if I ever am a pastor again, I never want to feel that again. And I don't miss that at all of like needing to know the answers because I did. I was that guy when I was a young pastor. I knew I knew the answers that I was supposed
Mhm.
to know and I could give you the answers. But none of those were textbook answers. And they weren't rooted in my own discovery or my intuition, my experience. It wasn't something that I had to grasp onto for dear life necessarily. I regret the certainty at which I held my previous beliefs. There was a lot of arrogance there, but I'm not hard on myself at all. Like, after all, I had a fear-based mentality. Like, that certainty was necessary. It was keeping me safe in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
framework.
So I'm thinking about your book and I'm thinking about, for some people, a lot of people, like revolutionary ideas about hell. Honestly, like until very recently, until the last year or two, that was never even a possibility in my mind.
Well,
I
game
well, I will
changer, huh?
say, I know, like Rob Bell, like people like that, I've heard the idea in like recent years, but talk to me about, so you leave, you're going through this process, you're questioning, but you're also rebuilding, you're like figuring out the pieces that you want to maintain with this belief, this relationship with God, but also not with the harmful shit that came with a lot of what you grew up in. So what happened after that? Like, did you get another job? Did you stay home and write? How did you come to this place to write this incredible book?
Hmm. Well, first of all, thank you for calling it incredible. I do love to hear it. I'm glad you've had that nice
It
experience
is.
with it.
Yeah, for
That's so
sure.
cool. I love to hear how it's impacting folks. And I wrote the book that I wish I had because these are all the things that I was sorting through. And the book
Mm.
is basically the journey of things that I was wrestling with. I have always been uncomfortable with the doctrine of hell. From when I was a kid, I was afraid of hell, understandably. Like, I think if you're not afraid of it within that system, you just aren't a thoughtful person, or somehow you've like compartmentalized it, or you're just like experiencing cognitive dissonance or something. But if you really
Mm.
sit with it and allow yourself to take it seriously, and I think those of us who have like deconstructed often are the ones that took it the most seriously. Like, we really believed this shit that they were telling us,
Oh,
and
yeah. Yeah.
we wrote it all the way down. We weren't trying to run away from it. We were taking it really seriously. And with hell in particular, I never wanted to believe in it. Like, it always felt at odds with the reality of who I felt God to be, but it didn't feel like that was negotiable. It didn't seem like that was an option to take that out. Like, that's just a part of the framework. In fact, not only was it a part of the framework because it was taught to me and because I was told that's what the Bible said, but it literally was the glue that held a lot of it together. And I talk about this in my book a little bit. In the book, I use the illustration of like trying to deconstruct hell is like pulling a thread on a sweater that threatens to unravel the whole sweater. An illustration that I use that I maybe even like better than that one is it's like the load-bearing Jenga brick in the tower, where if you try to take hell out of Christianity, it does feel like the whole thing collapses, because if there's no hell, why be a Christian instead of something else? Because if nobody's going to go to hell, then why do you have to be a Christian? If there's no hell, then why did Jesus die? Because didn't he die to save us from hell? In what sense is he a savior? Why does Jesus even matter if there's no hell? A lot of those questions, because it really was an afterlife-based spirituality that many of us received. And it was about being in that category where we receive spiritual safety by being an insider, by being one of the saved. And we had that belonging to the church to prove that safety in that spiritual status. And so as I began to do more reading, probably around 2017, 2018, I was like really deeply diving into hell, reading everything I could get a hold of. And even then, I talked about this in my book. My initial stop was as an annihilationist. So the traditional Christian position is eternal conscious torment, which is as bad as it sounds. It means that everyone who's not a believer in the proper way is going to be eternally tormented in a way that they're consciously aware of forever and ever and ever. They will suffer. And that seemed horrible. And it's quite a sadistic view of God, that any God who would allow this to happen. Because again, if we're talking about every non-Christian, then we're not talking about this happening to some people, but actually most people. So the default like fate of humanity is eternal suffering. Like, that's a very bleak worldview when you think about it. All the good news is really silly.
And in pretty direct opposition to a lot of what Jesus talks about.
Yeah, I have a chapter in the book where I argue for a universal salvation, where I point out a lot of verses that say just the opposite, that talk a lot about God's desire to save the world, about how all the world is reconciled to God, about God's love for the whole world, which it just doesn't, a God who loves the whole world and is reconciling the whole world to God's self, that doesn't seem to be compatible with the majority of humans that have ever existed suffering for all of eternity. But I didn't know how to uproot that from my faith, because it did seem so central. And so as I wrestled with it, the position that I landed on at first was annihilationism, which is the belief that God won't torture unbelievers for eternity. They'll simply be sort of snuffed out of existence. They'll be destroyed. And that's really not hard to get to biblically. There is a lot of destruction language in the Bible in terms of the death of the wicked, the destruction of the wicked. Very little language actually about torture or torment. That word torment primarily comes from a passage in Revelation 14 where it says the smoke of their torment will rise up forever. But this isn't, it's in the apocalyptic book of Revelation. First of all, this is an apocalyptic vision that John is having. And so the fact that one verse, that's really the only place where the fire and the torment are kind of together. And then if you read that into everything else the Bible says about, end times and the death of the wicked, then you're kind of putting that picture on everything. And I just don't think we were meant to do that. The annihilation position it's still a punishing position. And in my framework, and I share this story in the book where I changed my mind. I can't remember exactly when this was. I want to say it was around 2018 or so that I got the balls to talk to the lead pastor of the church I was at. Again, I was a multi-site church, and I had come to this place where I no longer believed in the traditional position of hell, but our church website said in the statement of faith that we believe that unbelievers will suffer in hell forever. And I no longer believe that. I still believe that something that they would be destroyed in this way, but I didn't think God was going to maintain them in this state of torture forever. And so I felt like out of conscience, I needed to talk to my boss about this. And when I told him that I had shifted my position, he said to me, he was like, okay, so you don't believe that unbelievers are going to suffer in hell forever? I was like, correct. I think that they'll be destroyed. It's much more biblical. And he was like, okay, just to be clear, you still think something bad's going to happen to them, right? And I was like, yes, totally. Like annihilation, very bad, like horrible. And as I reflect on that, I can see why I had to stop there. And I wasn't a university at the time, because the framework, the evangelical framework, there just has to be a punishment. It is a punitive story. It is a story about punishment. From the beginning, you are born by default worthy of punishment. The only way to understand yourself is that you are a sinner who deserves to be punished. And God is ultimately a punisher. And you have to be in a right relationship with God. And what that ultimately means is that you're on the right side of that punishment line, that you're not going to suffer in hell because you're one of the ones that is saved and redeemed. But that insider mentality that, oh, I'm one of the saved ones, that safety is only achieved by the existence of an out group. And so there has to be, when he said something bad still happens to them, right? There has to be something bad and there has to be a them. There has to be an out group and there has to be a punishment. I think in many ways that's the core of evangelical theology, which is why hell is so difficult to deconstruct. Because when you take out the punitiveness, all of a sudden it's like, well, what's the point of spirituality? Which shows how shallow it is. Every time somebody asks me, when I say I don't believe hell is a literal place, one of the first questions I get from everybody is, if there's no hell, what's the point of being a Christian, or what's the point of Jesus? And to me, I always just point that back at them and point out what a shallow spirituality that is. You just think about it for just a moment, that if what you're saying is, oh, it's about punishment avoidance, and they'll say, no, it's not just about that. It's also about, growing in love and the fruits of spirits and all these other things. Well, it's like, well, why isn't that enough? Why isn't it enough to have a spirituality that is about growing in love in this life for the sake of the world, especially the most vulnerable people in the world, even if there was no punishment in the afterlife? That's not enough for you. I actually think there's a real deficiency in our faith. And ultimately, hell is used as a control tactic to make us stay in a thing that is not working for us.
Yes. I mean, I don't even know what to say, because I'm just like, but 100%. Yes, that. I mean, you're right, because so much of when you take hell away, if then your belief is shook, what is your belief? Like, you are essentially saying, like, when I hear you describe it in that way, in that succinct way, I'm like, yeah, and if that's the case, then what you are saying is your belief in God, your belief in Jesus is one that is solely based around hell and punishment, which again feels paradoxical to this idea when Jesus talks about love first and foremost, like love, love, love. And it's interesting because when I think back to like my time in the evangelical church, and I think about this duality, I remember hearing both of those messages, the punishment, the like suffering, you have to be on the right side, you have to do the right things, say the right things to get to this. And also, but also we're all about love. But it was very conditional, and it never it never made sense to me. I could never reconcile. I never questioned it necessarily, but I remember sitting there going like, I'm not like something isn't connecting. Something is not making sense here. Is it love? Is it punishment? Is it about how I act? Or are you going to love me no matter what? I don't know.
Right. Because even the words unconditional love would be used, but
But it's not. It's not unconditional, because if it
what
was,
does it mean to you?
right, if you love someone unconditionally, are they going to be punished in hell
I
forever?
typically don't torture the people that I love unconditionally.
No.
Not the vibe I'm trying to create.
100%. And even the likening of Jesus to a father and a child. And now that I have kids, I'm like, oh my God, how traumatic to think about your parent like that. I mean, really. And that's when I think about the hurt that the church has done. If you are saying that Jesus is your father, but then you have to do what he says in the way that he says it in order to get the reward in heaven, it just, so much of it, you go, wait, what?
Yeah.
This up.
Totally. So for me, one of the benefits I had as I wrestled through all this is that, like I said, I was doing a lot of reading outside of my sort of small evangelical world. I mean, there's a vast amount of beautiful Christian writing from all kinds of different perspectives, to include marginalized perspectives. I found myself very drawn to liberation theology, Black liberation theology, basically voices from the margins. And what I often found, and I was doing this reading while I was still a pastor, and this stuff did inform my work as an evangelical. Liberation theology is basically, I mean, this is the gospel that Jesus preached. Jesus didn't come and say, I have good news, everybody. If you don't want to go to hell, then you have to believe in what I did for you on the cross and you can be saved and you'll go to heaven when you die. That wasn't the message of Jesus. The message of Jesus was the kingdom of God. This was the stated purpose of Jesus, was to declare the kingdom of God. And some of us have read that wrong and we think, oh, that's about going to heaven. But that is actually not at all what that meant. And even conservative evangelical scholars will tell you the message of the kingdom of God was a this worldly message. It was about the
Hmm.
rule and reign of God on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, what does God want this world to be like? That's the world that we're supposed to build, a world that reflects God's love for everybody. That was the message of Jesus. And it was good news to the poor, first of all. When Jesus declared his message, he says, I am here. Why I'm here in Luke chapter 4, to proclaim good news to the poor, liberation to the oppressed, to declare the year of the Lord's favor, which is the Jubilee year, a year in the Hebrew law where debts are canceled, slaves are set free, wealth is redistributed. In other words, it's a world where everybody has enough, where people have what they need, where people flourish and experience shalom, the peace of God. This in this life, on this world. And liberation theology really emphasizes this worldly message of Jesus specifically towards vulnerable people, oppressed people. And what I was wrestling with as I was reading that, I didn't know how to hold both of those because I thought I had to believe the good, right evangelical theology about Jesus dying on the cross for my sins so that I could go to heaven when I die and not hell, because he bore the wrath in my place. The punishment that I deserved was put on him instead of me. So God doesn't have to punish me. Jesus is punished instead. That was the gospel according to evangelicalism. The gospel according to liberation theology is good news for the poor. Jesus has proclaimed a kingdom where the poor are healed and the oppressed are set free. That was the gospel. And those are two very different gospel messages. And I was trying to hold them both together for a while and think, okay, the good news, in other words, is good news for this life and the next life, liberation in this life and sort of afterlife salvation. And at some point, I realized that I didn't have to do that. And in fact, that focus on the afterlife was actually, it was never going to work to have both, in my opinion, because as soon as you say, yeah, it's good news for the poor and vulnerable of this life, but also you have to believe the right things or you're going to go to hell, that message will always squash out the other one because the stakes are so high. It's such an all-encompassing reality. Hell is the worst possible thing that could ever happen to anybody. How could you say that like some short, brief moment of injustice really matters all that much compared to eternal torture? That is the bigger, it's always going to suck the air out of the room and become the priority. And so in some ways, because I had been exposed to a lot of this reading, it was easier for me to flesh out. And what I do in this book is help people flesh out how to hold on to, I think, a relevant, this worldly gospel message that flows directly out of the message of Jesus that is not about the afterlife. It's about this life.
Yes. And I think one thing, like when reading your book, one of the things I love the most about it is that there's this feeling in reading it of going like, oh, yes. Like, I wish I could articulate that better, but there is this release of weight that if you grew up in this, you go, that connects. Like that, I have it right over here. That's why I'm pointing at it. I'm like, that connects, right? This is something, what you are describing here and in the book, I'm going, yeah, that's what my soul has been trying to connect to for so long. Didn't have the language, didn't have the way to articulate it, but reading it and going, yes, just in my gut, when I think of my relationship and spirituality and God, that's it. And so, yeah, I think this is a big ad for you to say, just go read your book. But
I'll take it.
thank you. Yeah. Thank you so
That makes
much.
me really happy. I did want people to feel validated. Don't think that, I know that my situation wasn't unique and that my journey was not unique. However, I have a unique vantage point as somebody who was both in that world deeply and also was able to do a lot of study around it to hopefully say some things out loud that I don't know why more people don't say them out loud, to be honest.
I don't think people know. I honestly, Brian.
Well, I think a lot of pastors should know better, but yeah, I mean, to me, if you've studied, like anybody who's studied the Greek, we know, for instance, that the word that Jesus uses that's translated hell is Gehenna, which does not mean a fiery torture chamber. It literally means the Valley of Hinnom, an actual real ass valley outside of Jerusalem. So that's a really bad translation. Most pastors know that.
Or you would hope.
Yeah. I mean, and they would just say, oh, well, that word means that valley, but no, this is definitely about the afterlife. But like, why? Why is it? Why are you so sure about that? So much and ultimately I understand, like they're trying to be good company men. In other words, they're in the system too, and they're playing by the system's rules. And the system is a punitive one.
Yeah.
I have a whole chapter in the book about the way that the system protects itself. I kind of wrestled as to whether to include that chapter because it is a bit of a detour off of the main sort of argument that I'm making. But I felt like it was important to talk about the fact that there are all kinds of systemic pressures that keep us from really being honest about what's happening in the Bible and what's happening in our own souls.
Mm-hmm,
Because
mm-hmm.
these pastors have a lot to lose, to be honest about
Yes, so much to lose. I mean, like you mentioned earlier, your community, your job, your family, so to speak. I mean, not necessarily your immediate family, but your larger
Well, I
family.
mean, I ultimately got divorced as in the process of
Right?
deconstruction,
Yeah.
and I think that's a very common experience for many people
Mm-hmm.
deconstructing. It is very costly because once you kind of put a lot of the fundamental assumptions on the table, you are looking at the things that shaped your identity coming into question. I mean, when you lose a lot of our identity is shaped by the communities that we belong to. And so to lose belonging in a community and then also to lose a lot of the meaning making ideas that provided certainty and control is to really lose a core of who you are. And everything's on the table after that. It is a slippery slope. They're right about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not controlled. You don't know where it's going to take you. You don't know where it's going to
Mm-hmm.
end up once you start. I think if you're on an authentic journey, like that's okay because you actually
Mm-hmm.
know what that prison was like, and you knew that
Mm-hmm.
the entirety of yourself wasn't allowed to exist in that world.
Yeah.
And so I think you kind of have to ride that slope a little bit. Unfortunately, it can be very scary.
Yeah, it can. What would you say to anybody listening? Like, what is one kind next step that they can do for themselves in this journey that doesn't feel too overwhelming?
Well, it all does depend on where you're at in the journey. I don't know whether these are people who are still in the church or outside of the church. I do think for me, a lot of it does start with trusting yourself. In other words, what I would say, so one of the feedback points that has been really interesting about my book from people is how, for a lot of people, it was a really scary experience to even purchase it. In other words, just the act
Mm,
of buying a book that's
wow.
questioning the literal reality of hell is like
Yeah.
triggering their religious fear. Like, oh, does buying this book make me a heretic? Which means, in other words, that if I'm wrong, I'm going to hell. And that's
Yeah.
really fucking scary for people. And
Yeah.
so one girl, for instance, reached out and she said, I've just bought your book after wrestling with it for like a week. And I finally told myself, okay, you're being silly. Like you want this book, you want to read it.
Mhm.
Just listen. You can just buy it and you don't have to agree with everything.
Mhm.
You can just expose yourself to the information. And if it's heresy and if it's wrong, then you'll set it aside. And if you agree with it, then so I'll save the whether I agree with it for another day. Right now I'm just buying it. So she had to do that mental gymnastics in order to even read it. And I was like, this is fascinating. So I shared that DM in my stories. And I asked my following, I was like, does this resonate with anybody else? 70% of the people in the poll said yes, they had a similar experience of religious guilt
Whoa.
when they went to buy the book.
Wow.
And so what I would say is for some of those people, just the act of buying it would be actually a
Mm.
healing step because it's listening to that part of you. Like if you want to buy a book that says, hey, maybe there's more to the story than you've been told. Hey,
Mhm.
maybe God doesn't punish people.
Mm.
Why do you think you want to buy that? In other words,
Mhm.
there's a part of you that feels like God must be better than that God must be more loving than that maybe God wouldn't punish people for eternity. That's what your heart is actually
Mhm.
telling you. That's why you're drawn to buying this book, that your conscience and your heart is telling you one thing,
Mm.
but you feel like, oh, you might be wrong because what if I'm going against God? And I
Yeah.
guess what I would say is, if you feel like a loving part of yourself is pulling you in a certain direction, and it's coming from a place of compassion, love, kindness, care, I would say that is the voice of God. And that's the
Mm.
voice you should be listening to. Not the voice of, but am I going to conform to authority? But how am I going
Mhm.
to be judged by my community? But am I going to experience, punishment? Are you letting fear, punishment, authority, and hierarchy drive your decisions, or the voice of love inside of you? Where is
Mm.
God speaking out of? Is God speaking out of the hierarchies of domination that are trying to keep you in line? Or is God speaking out of the still small voice of love? And I would say it's the latter.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so powerful. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here, for being so vulnerable, always, for being authentic, for writing this book, for being the one that's, one of the ones I think I would say that's speaking out about this so wonderfully and beautifully and with so much love. I think it's what you're doing is incredibly impactful and healing and just amazing. So thank you.
Thanks, Nikki.
And my final question, completely unrelated to everything we've just talked about. I have a segment called Ridiculous or Relatable. So, something that you do that is completely ridiculous, but to others might be a little bit relatable. I can give you an example.
Yeah, give me an example. Give me
I
one.
have so many. I have pages, which is a little embarrassing. Okay, one that came up recently, it's the holidays and singing Christmas music with my kids all the time. I realized that when I sing alone with no music, I always cry.
Hmm.
And not sad cry. Like my eyes start watering and I start tearing up, even if I'm
Oh, okay.
smiling. It's such a weird but powerful thing. And so I can't sing in front of a lot of people because then I just start crying and people are like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know. I'm just crying. I don't know."
Man, I feel like my whole life is such a hot mess, honestly. Like at every turn, it's probably ridiculous and relatable. But right now I'm in a very unrelatable season. I've been doing like a book tour, and so I'm traveling a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, people probably won't relate with the level at which I'm traveling, but I'm trying to like tour my book while also navigate being in a long distance relationship that also
Mm-hmm.
requires travel. And so
Boy.
a ridiculous thing that's maybe not relatable to too many people that's happening right now is that my girlfriend, in order to see her at all, because we're both divorced, and we both have custody schedules. So we have our kids every other
Oh.
weekend.
Oh
And
yeah.
so we share custody with our co-parents where we live.
Mm-hmm.
She's in Detroit and I'm in Raleigh. So neither of us can move
Yeah.
because of the fact that we have
Gosh.
custody where we live. And so that's ridiculous right there, that I'm in a relationship that I cannot be with the person that I'm in a
Mm-hmm.
relationship with.
Oh.
And our children are quite young. So I have 8-year-olds, she has 7-year-olds. And so it's at least 10 years till like all the kids are out of the house to
Mm-hmm.
where we could move. And so, yeah, maybe the ridiculous but relatable thing is that when we first started talking, both of us were like, oh, well, clearly we can't be in a relationship, but we like each other. So what's the harm of talking? Because we were both pretty freshly divorced.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so we weren't necessarily looking for something super serious. We were just like, hey, what's the harm in just like
Yeah.
enjoying this
Yeah.
chemistry, etc. But you got to be really careful with what you do in that attraction chemistry phase, because then we fell in love, and now here we are like 3 years later, still together with 10 years of long
Mm-hmm.
distance to go. And
Wow.
right now, during this time, in order to see each other at all, because I'm doing a book tour, she has to meet me on the road. So I'm going to Nashville next week when I don't have my kids. Instead of going to see her or her coming to see me, I'm going to do some traveling and speaking. And so she's been meeting me at my speaking engagements,
Oh,
which has been really sweet. But she
that
has
is
now heard
sweet.
the same talk about hell like 8 times. And she doesn't even have religious trauma. She's not a Christian and
Mm.
didn't even grow up as a Christian. She grew up as a secular Jew. So she's literally like hearing me talk about this shit that doesn't even apply to her.
That's
And
love.
just dealing with it. Yeah, so that's been kind of ridiculous. I have no idea if any of that is relatable to anybody. The one other person that's in a long distance relationship is relating to me right
Yeah.
now.
Oh, I'm sure I mean, maybe not the exact situation, but I think that the long distance piece is relatable. I think many of us have at least had one period of that. I know my current husband now and we did that for the first. We could only last 8 months, and I was like, I gotta move. But that was
For sure.
pre-kids.
And that's
I mean,
fine.
that's hard. That's so hard. I can't imagine.
Yeah, right. Like I think we thought that we would never do it, because it was like, well, it's one thing. I don't mind a long distance relationship if there's like, hey, if this begins to really work out, then one of us would ultimately move, right? And that's just not in the cards for us. So I don't know what the hell we were thinking. So yeah, the lesson learned is you got to be real careful with what you do when those neurons are firing and you're not thinking
Uh-huh.
clearly.
Oh
Mm.
man. Well, good luck. And again, thank you so much for being here. It was so great to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nikki. It was really fun.
I just want to say thank you so much to Brian for being here today. What an incredibly powerful conversation. And I hope each of you go out and get his new book, Hellbent. If you want to learn more about Brian or get connected with him, you can follow him on Instagram. You can also visit his website, brianrecker.com. I'll make sure to put all the links below in the show notes. If this episode resonated with you, it would mean the world to me if you could support the show and help it grow. First, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, because your words help new listeners to find us. Second, share the episode with someone who might need it, because that's how this community grows, through real people, real stories, and honest conversations shared from one person to another. Finally, make sure you follow the show so you never miss an episode. Just tap the little plus sign or follow button on the main show page. These really are the most impactful things that you can do for the podcast. So thank you again for listening. And this week, take some time to recognize what in your life is full of bothness. And remember, it's okay to feel all the things, because so many times in life, it isn't either or. It's both.